Hello everyone and welcome to my presentation for PriceFest 2021. My name is Josh Gaines and this is Sliding Gestures in Florence Price's Rainbow Waltz. Before we fully get started, I would like to acknowledge that the research for this presentation was done on ancestral Nacotchtank and Piscataway land. I highly encourage you all, once this is over, to look up Indigenous tribes and First Nations in your area, contribute to land back campaigns, and personal donations, whatever you can to further some of these Native causes. The way this presentation is going to go is I'm going to begin by giving you all the state of the music theoretic research around Florence Price's music and sort of a summary of all the different papers that I have looked at. Then I'm going to go into a basic overview of the piece, Rainbow Waltz, the basic form, harmony, character of it, all that kind of stuff. And then we're going to get into the weeds with my construction of sliding gestures and how that plays into gesture theory, as well as where they appear in the piece and my actual analysis of how it affects my perception and interpretation of it all. And then we'll finish it out with some closing thoughts and further inquiries and ideas that I've had in my research of this work and being so close to it, and sort of how some of you might even be able to jump in at that point. So without further ado, let's get started. When it comes to the music theoretic research on Florence Price's music, I've arranged a lot of the essays and books and journals that I've read into 5 main lenses through which the authors look at the music. First is the historical lens, where these authors give you a sense of how the music theory plays into general trends around the timing of the works and the time period, as well as how it pertains to her own life and history. Then for the basic harmony and form, these authors give a nice sense of the key structure and basic harmonic analysis and formal sections of the works that they look at. For the performance-based lenses, these authors tend to give you a sense of how it feels to play the piece, what are the different aspects that go into performing it, tips, things along those lines. For the pedagogical lens, these authors give you a sense of the different techniques that go into the pieces as it pertains to teaching students, different levels of education and how they would go about organizing the works, especially Price's pedagogical works. And then lastly, the semiotics lens tends to look at especially the African American and Black idioms that go into Price's music and how she uses that to balance out a lot of her traditionalist Eurocentric ideas on music and harmony, how she makes meaning through all of it. It is a lovely, amazing work that is, or section that is very cross-disciplinary, and so a lot of the semiotics work is fantastic. Those of you that are quite familiar with a lot of the current research that has been done probably realizes that I've left out 2 very recent dissertations, notably Dr. Samantha Ega and Dr. Marquise Carter's works. They could basically have been in underneath all of those categories as they are just massive, massive works of scholarship. Dr. Ega's chapter 3 of her dissertation goes into the sonata in E minor, in which she looks at the semiotics and that signifying aspect of the idioms that are at play. She talks a lot about her own performance perspective as the pianist and the way she embodies the work, the arm movements that are at play, and the different agency that is going on in those movements. Dr. Carter, in their dissertation, takes a look at the art songs of Price. And they do a wonderful job of taking a look at the semiotics and signifying aspects that go into it, especially the poetry. They take a look at it through a womanist and very intersectional lens, as well as talking about the double consciousness aspects from W.E. Du Bois. And so as a whole, they give a ton of narrative analysis, harmonic analysis, poetic analysis, historical analysis, and talks about the performance as well. So just as a 2 works of really significant theoretic research being done, highly recommend checking out both of these. So with all of that music theoretic background now, and we're going to start moving into how I play into all of that. So I'm going to give you a quick overview of the history of Rainbow Waltz. It was composed most likely in 1939. That's when the manuscript is dated. The manuscript can be found in the University of Arkansas Special Collections with a ton of the other lovely manuscripts there. And it was originally published in 2016 in an album of piano pieces, which was edited by Barbara Garvey Jackson. And her contribution to Price's work has been phenomenal in general. Now, when I first started looking at this piece, I was immediately struck by the title. I was like, oh, this looks adorable, this is a cute piece. But I could not find any recordings at all. There were none that I could find professionally, none on YouTube, but in the past year or so, two have appeared on YouTube, one uploaded by Professor Kevin Wayne Bumpers and the other by user Suikun, who's actually a personal friend of mine. The basic harmonic and form structure of Rainbow Waltz is as follows. It is in ABACA form, typical of a waltz. Begins in D flat major. The B section modulates to our flat 6 key, A major and harmonically. Very typical of Price. She loves her third modulations. Then there is an exact repetition of the A section, followed by our C section in G flat major, the key of 4. And that is very typical of a waltz as well, before we return for a mostly the same A section with a bit of a coda tacked on to the end, which turns it a bit more into an A prime section. As I began to look at this piece, I was immediately struck by the title, Rainbow Waltz. So in my mind, I'm asking, well, where's that rainbow coming from? After much ado, my hypothesis, no way of knowing for sure, is coming from this opening 5 bars of the piece. Take a listen, played by Professor Kevin Wayne Bumpers. So that opening gesture, starting on that low D flat, rising all the way up to that F, and then coming gradually back down to that D flat, A flat fifth, that I think is one of the rainbows that is at play. We have a rise and fall in pitch, and if you imagine playing that on a piano, granted, I am not a pianist, so this is a very naive interpretation of it. You're starting at the left hand of the piano, moving yourself to the right, and then coming all the way back down to the same position. Those different arcs, both in pitch and physicality, are my thoughts on where the rainbow is. Also of note, at the beginning of section B, you have this lovely contour in the right hand that comes up and back down, and in C, in the C section as well, you have these little arcs of ba-da-dee-da-da going back and forth as a motive. So this got me thinking, not necessarily that this is super important, but it got me focused on gesture and the physicality of motion and all these rising and fallings. And so that is where we are going to take this, with gesture. Now, when I use the word gesture, I want to be very specific about what I mean by that, because that's one of those terms that has so many different meanings depending on whose writing you're exactly looking at. And so mine definitely falls under Hatton's really, purposefully broad definition as a significant energetic shaping through time, and he's got a whole big theory about gesture. But most closely, my use is related to Michael Buckler's use of it in his 2020 article, Ornamentation as Gesture in Atonal Music, where he says it's a somewhat ad hoc application of gesture theory, and he really delves into interval content, hierarchic potential, the fact that the gestures have to have clear endpoints and timing. There's a very short span of time, and he goes into different accented aspects of them all. My use is distinctively not as formal as instrumental gesture as D'Souza and Montague use it in their respective writings. That one is much more focused on very measured qualities of playing an instrument. Mine is much more qualitative. Now that we are clear on what I mean when I say gesture, we can start to construct sliding gestures for Rainbow Waltz. Now, these are gestural gestalts, or a type of gesture, that have the following 4 properties. Number 1 is stepwise motion. That easy voice leading lends an element of smoothness to the gestures. There's chromaticism, which can emphasize that stepwise motion with half steps, or if you have the sense chromaticism as stepping between keys, you might be slipping between, slipping out, slipping into various chords or keys. Number 3 is a 2-part stress schema. I tend to, when I think and feel sliding, I either feel like I am going from somewhere light and pressing into something heavier, or I'm steady somewhere and lifting off. And so that stress on stress tends to play a role in how I feel these slides. And lastly, number 4 involves that physical action of playing the piano in this piece. Typically, this would occur in the wrists, fingers, or arm, and can look like smooth horizontal motion, like we were talking about with the rainbow, but also possibly grasping motions in the fingers, say from the black keys down to the white keys, and that sort of vertical or diagonal grasping motion. Now, with all these properties in mind, the gestures as they appear in the music may have all four. They may have really strong aspects of one and weaker aspects of the other. That's all right. Because it's kind of a gestalt in dealing with perception, these are all just adding to the effect of these gestures. To get a sense of what I mean by sliding gestures, let's take a look at this example from measure 17. I've circled the gesture in question in the right hand. First off, there is stepwise motion. That E natural to F is moving by step, and so that is nice and smooth. There is chromaticism, the E flat from measure 16 to moving to the E natural and then up resolving to that F provides that smooth motion between strong chord tones. And when it comes to the stress schema, I always hear this one as unstressed moving into stress, partially because that eighth note is shorter than the dotted quarter, but also because it is on the offbeat moving to a beat, and the hypermetric placement is on a very strong hypermeasure, so the downbeat gets a lot of emphasis and that offbeat feels much less stressed. And the fact that when it comes to the harmonic content, that E natural is a non-chord tone moving into that third of our tonic chord. And so that third is very important in my mind to the way this measure sounds. And then lastly, when it comes to the physicality, moving from that E natural, D flat, E natural to that F, D flat, F involves a bit of rotation of the wrist. When it came to the fingerings on both YouTube videos, they either go from 1 and 4 to 1 and 5 for that octave, or from 1 to 5 to 1 to 5. And so there's a very sort of blocked out hand position that moves up. And that smooth transition continues up to that high A at the end of the measure back in treble clef. And so there's this energy moving to the right in a very smooth fashion. That example in measure 17 is a great example of what I'm calling embellishing sliding gestures. Embellishing sliding gestures tend to be foregrounded on the musical surface, so they don't tend to involve the chords that much. It operates in pitch space, so we're looking at specific notes moving to specific other notes, as opposed to more abstract pitch class spaces. It tends to happen over a shorter time span, and the gesture tends to emphasize non-chord tones as sort of the highlight of the gesture. Compare that to harmonic gestures, harmonic sliding gestures, which tend to be foregrounded at the harmonic layer. They're involving chord-to-chord motion, which are operating in pitch class space, so we are looking at that more abstract voice leading. They tend to be able to go over a longer time span, measure to measure, as opposed to note to note. And we're emphasizing the chord tones, where we're looking at strong chord members moving to other strong chord members. Stepwise motion, that one criteria, can apply to the bass. It can also apply to the root of the chord, and so our definitions and perceptions can expand a little bit at that point. So let's look at an example of a harmonic sliding gesture now. This example for measures 45 and 46 is a great example of a harmonic sliding gesture. We are in the key of A, so we're in the B section of the waltz, moving from an E flat major chord to our normal dominant E major chord. So there is stepwise motion going on between both the root, E flat to E, and there's smooth voice leading across the bar line, that B flat to B natural, G to G sharp, in the soprano, B flat down to A, so lots of smooth voice leading happening. It is chromatic. That E flat major chord feels far out of left field in A major. It was set up and tonicized, but then to immediately move into E natural is very sudden at that point. When it comes to the stress schema, in this case, our measure 45, that downbeat on that E flat major chord is more stressed. It is in a root position chord as opposed to inverted or displaced beat structure. The hypermetric placement, 45, measure 45, is a stronger hypermetric measure. And there's a bit of a hemiola effect in the right hand that really jars the attention to that measure. And like I was saying before, it was tonicized, so there was a bit of setup. meaning that the resolution occurred on 45. Moving into this unstressed, just hike it up a half step to get to measure 46. And lastly, when it comes to the physicality, again, we can look at that motion between the right hand and the left hand moving across the bar line. And you can see just moving down by step, moving up by step, and you have some of these rotations in the wrist again. Now that we know about embellishing sliding gestures and harmonic sliding gestures, we can really start to see how Florence Price has composed them into the various sections of Rainbow Waltz. Beginning in the A section, we will see that there are predominantly embellishing sliding gestures happening at the musical surface. The harmonic sliding gestures that are used are really only reserved for important cadences, namely halfway through and at the end of the section, and most of the gestures are stressed to unstressed. What this means for the section is that it feels like we are very stable in our harmony, which makes sense as the first thing we hear and the section we keep coming back to, but the musical surface, the melody, is still very fun and gets our attention. The harmonic sliding gestures reserved for the cadences means that it feels a little more exciting when we're driving to the cadence, and it's highlighting the sort of two-part phrase structure that's going on in the section. The stressed unstressed feel helps the stress to fall on either the second beat of a measure or the downbeat, and that really adds to that distinctive waltz feel of 1, 2, 3 as we go along, a little bit lilting throughout the entire A section. So now I'm going to take you into the music and sort of just lay out all of the different gestures that I feel and I perceive as I'm listening through the piece. The ones that are circled in blue are going to be embellishing gestures. The ones circled in orange, not on this page yet, are going to be harmonic sliding gestures. Because I'm going through quick, I'm not going to give all the different criteria for each one, so feel free to pause the video, listen to the YouTube videos, play through it yourself, see if you can feel them on your own. But here we go. Starting in measure 2 and 3, we have that B flat falling to A flat. Measure 4, we have that little slide up in the right hand. An exact repeat of that in measures 6 through 8. And then we get a bit more chromatic in 9 and 11 with these gestures that feel very like graspy or sliding up in 9 and 11. And then in 10 and 12, we have these sort of falling slide gestures. In measures 14 through 24, you can see we have much more blue, so still more embellishing gestures going on. In measure 17, that E natural to F that we used as an example, and then B flat to A in 18, 19. 20 has, again, one of those more chromatic sliding ones going up on the offbeat. Same with 21, it's just a repeat of that E natural F again. And then in 22 and 23, we have that E flat to D flat going on in the left hand. Now, there is also our first harmonic slide gesture here, and it's one of the weaker ones in the ones that I found in the piece. It's nowhere near as clear as the one we used as an example, but there is still some stepwise motion in that tenor voice, that D flat to C. It is going from a weak hypermetric measure to a stronger one, and a weak form of that 5-7 add 6 of 5 to our really strong dominant 5-9, especially coming from measure 13, which is back there as well, which is a stronger dominant of dominant. And so we're sort of sliding through this weaker form to get to our 5-9 chord. In measures 25 to 32, we see the end of the A section. The chords here are much more stable, so there's less sliding gestures going on, but we do have two very strong ones. In 27, we have those octaves BA embellishing gesture, and we have a really strong harmonic sliding gesture. We have hit our Neapolitan in measure 27. It is our flat 2 chord. It lasts for 2 whole measures, and that D major chord goes into a D flat major in second inversion, that 1-6-4 chord going on. And all of that half step motion is shown with those orange arrows, and it really sort of jars us in and slides us back to that ending cadence that's eventually going to go 2-5-1 to finish off the section. Moving into the B section, we see that Price has really rebalanced all of the gestures going on. In particular, we start right off the bat with harmonic sliding gestures in the first few bars. Embellishing gestures throughout are mostly reserved for the melody and tends to be more of a melodic line of single notes rather than, like we saw in the A section, all of these sort of chords from one to the next. There is also chromatic bass motion happening in the first phrase that is part of these harmonic gestures that really gives a drive to a high point. What this means for the section is that with that chromatic ascent, we have all of these hypermetric accents that occur in the measures 1 and 3 and 5. That's that stress and unstress going on. The embellishing gestures in the melody tend to give this section to me a very like spinning waltz feel. It's that section where everyone's dancing and spinning around, especially because the contour of the melody kind of winds up and down a lot. And the chromatic bass motion gives that like slow slide up in the first 8 bars to really juxtapose with the second 8 measures, the second phrase, which tends to be more focused on these chains of dominance and fifth relations. So let's go look at them now. Here you can see right away there's much more orange, and I've circled kind of these 3-bar phrases at a time, sometimes 2 depending on how you feel them. But look at this bass line. A, next measure A sharp, third measure B, then B sharp, then C sharp. We have this chromatic ascent in the bass, and all of this half-step motion going on in, say, measures 34 and 35, where those arrows are, that A sharp moving up to that B, that F double sharp moving to that G sharp, A sharp moving to B. We have all of this chromatic motion that's just sliding through that second measure to get to that next main chord tone. In measures 36, 37, and 38, we have all of those embellishing gestures where it's very lots of chromatic lines that are flipping around on themselves, and that measure 37, the bida, bida, bada, you have all of these like stress, unstress, stress, unstress, stress, unstress going on. And similarly in the last measure here, measure 40, you have that accented F natural E in the bass that slides into that bass note to really settle home that chord. And similarly in the soprano, you slide into the chord tones. In the second half of the B section, we see in measure 42 this E, E, D slide going on. That's very reminiscent of that A section to me. Our another harmonic slide, this is the one that we used as the example before, that flat 5 moving to 5 right before the final cadence. And we have a bit of an embellishing gesture that helps us transition back to that A section nicely, with that G to A flat in the bass and A to A flat in the soprano, C sharp to C natural going on. That embellishing gesture right at the end helps us slide back to that A section, which is mostly focused on embellishing gestures. Yet again in the C section, we have rebalanced our sliding gestures, and now we find that the beginning of the C section features an oscillating harmonic sliding gesture that goes back and forth between the same gesture several times over a pedal note. And that the embellishing sliding gestures are really kind of used melodically and motivically, those arcs that we talked about way back at the beginning of the rainbow discussion. These oscillating harmonic sliding gestures over that pedal give to me a sense of floating through this section. And also because it ends sort of 8 bars in, highlights again that 8 + 8 phrase structure. And all of these sliding gestures used motivically gives that sense of forward motion and doesn't just stop everything in its tracks now that our harmony is a lot more oscillatory. Here we see in measures 49 to 58 all of those little circled rainbow arcs in blue. Those are our little slides going up and down again in the right hand. And on the bottom you can see I've circled 6 to 5 7, 6 to 5 7, 6 to 5 7. That's our oscillating harmonic slide. Notice that it's happening, that 6 is happening over that D flat pedal. And so that D flat is the root of that 5-7 chord, and so you really have this almost suspended feeling of that 6th chord over that D flat, that E flat minor chord over D flat, resolving into that 5-7 dominant feel. And we repeat that several times as the pedal drops from that D flat 4 in measures 49 and 50 and 51 to D flat 3 in 52 and 53, and really hitting the low point in 54 through 56. 5/6 by the time we are really at our 5/7, moving into the second half of the C section to get to that G flat major chord finally. And at the end of the C section, we see a little bit more of those embellishing ba-da-dee-da-da arcs going on. And we have much more harmonic motion as well. This 5/6/4 of flat 3 to 5/7 of flat 3 is really sliding. You get that resolution from the 6/4 to the 7 chord, and then that 5/7 of flat 3 moving to our actual 5/7 is full of half step motion, and again, one of those slides into our dominant chord like we had seen in other sections as well. And then in measure 63, we have one last little recall to that 6 chord over that D flat, which is the same here, moving to that 5/7 to finish off the movement, the section strongly. I also briefly want to go through the end of the A prime section. Most of it is just like the A section, but as soon as we get to measure 91, it changes a bit, and we have these big embellishing sliding gestures in 91 and 92 in the right hand, spanning multiple octaves, with that fill in the left hand also feeling like a slide to me. And then measures 94 to 95, this deceptive cadence into flat 6. 5/7 of flat 6 is a big, nice slide in the left hand as well. And then the rousing finale to the piece, measures 101 to 108, is this beautiful D flat augmented arpeggiation down from up high all the way down low. And this is the first time we've had that augmented feel to our tonic chord. And in my mind, it very much feels like one last little slide, one last embellishing gesture where that A natural slides down to A flat in the last 2 bars to really just drive home the fact that we are home now. Now that we've gone through all of Rainbow Waltz and looked at the gestures that are there, I'd like to share a few closing thoughts with you all. First, that I really do believe that these sliding gestures help highlight the different aspects of Rainbow Waltz that I really like and attune to, and can help really describe for me how the piece feels, and I hope as a performer how it might feel as well. But of course, we're going to need more people to look at it. I would love to hear more performances of it, maybe even taking this work into account. Love to hear feedback from other people about these ideas, and sort of where this can go, these kinds of gestural analyses of works of Florence Price. Taking almost one step further back from the piece, I think this is also a really nice example of a way of looking at some of Price's music that doesn't easily fit into some of the more semiotic based analyses or ones that are looking for African American idioms. I think this piece, you could look at those. I'm just not sure it is necessarily the best fit for that type of analysis. And so perhaps this provides one more way of looking at Price's music. I would love to see what other gestures people find, what other kinds of performance-based analyses people might find in Price's music. I'm not a pianist, but I would love to hear how other people feel playing this music as opposed to just me being a listener. And then also, I think this is a wonderful opportunity to really dive into gesture theory as well and start talking about refining some of these gestures. Like I said previously, I have a very naive understanding of the physicality of it all, but I've also studied a bit of Le Bon's effort qualities, this sort of movement analysis stuff. And so words like pressing and floating and sliding that I've been using harkens a lot back to some of Le Bon's effort qualities that could be another way into some of this studying of physicality. So thank you all. I really hope that you have both found this interesting and has given you some good thought moving forward. The last bits are just some of the bibliography and the sources that I use. Feel free to pause through this, peruse at your own pleasure. Thank you so much to Dr. Carter again for helping organize this all, and the whole PriceFest board for the opportunity. And so thanks a lot, everyone.